Hello, everyone. I am Pastor Hazel Salazar-Davidson, and I serve as the assistant to the Bishop for Authentic Diversity, Inclusive Community, and Service here in the Sierra Pacific Synod. I am so excited to have author, artist, and activist Naomi Ortiz with us tonight and to introduce you to a book that has literally kept me going during these pandemics. A pandemic, as we know, is an epidemic of infectious disease that spreads across an entire region and, for instance, multiple continents and worldwide, which is where we're at right now. But I say these pandemics because I am talking about the global health pandemic with COVID, but also the pandemics of racism and violence. Both COVID and racism have been more on the forefront of social media feeds and news headlines and personal life experiences. And as a person of color and a Latina, it's really been exhausting to witness the daily onslaught of our siblings of color being mistreated and killed. And it's exhausting to hear my Asian American and Pacific Islander friends being blamed for the pandemic. It's exhausting to be blamed for church shortfalls. It's exhausting to have to explain to our marginalized experiences while still having to witness violence and experiencing trauma that's being done to our Black and African descent neighbors every single day. It's exhausting to witness those who are differently abled from us be continually ignored and gaslighted and pushed to the side. But because we're church leaders and we follow Jesus, we still show up. We love our neighbors and serve our community. And because we believe in the world that's better than we're currently in, we show up every day. So while we're showing up, many of us are feeling burnt out. And burnt out is a form of exhaustion that's caused by constantly feeling swamped. It's a result of excessive and prolonged emotional and physical and mental stress. So I was sharing these feelings with a dear friend of mine last year. And about a week later, I received a book in the mail, along with a little note saying that she hoped it helped. So what was the book? Well, Sustaining Spirit, Self-Care for Social Justice. I thumbed through it, read a few words, and then I did what any serious bookworm would actually do. And I Googled the author. I scoped around on the internet and I came across Naomi's website, where I read the following line: "Will burnout destroy me as an effective and productive advocate? How can I change the world when I'm too tired to even change my socks?" That stopped me in my tracks. And I noticed on her website that there was a video that showed other social justice-minded folks sharing similar reactions that I had had. So I want to share that with you now on her video.
I deeply care about the world, and yet
it's hard to monitor huge amounts of information that comes at me every day.
It's a challenge to try to change dysfunctional systems where I also experience trauma.
I care about the world, but I felt overworked by my organization.
I'm worried about burning out.
I struggle to make time for creative expression.
It's hard to witness injustice.
Injustice.
Where are you centered or rooted? How does your body connect with where you are right now?
Who we are starts from the ground up.
We can't help but be shaped by the place we live.
The ground beneath our bodies.
The book Sustaining Spirit, Self-Care for Social Justice says,
we must start where we are. Self-care is a practice.
Rooting to self-care means doing our own work of considering
and exploring questions.
We each need different types of tools.
And the book Sustaining Spirit, Self-Care for Social Justice
is your guide to do this work.
Welcome, Naomi. Thank you for taking time to be with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a privilege to be here.
I want to begin by getting to know you more. On the back of the cover of your book, it says that you identify yourself as disabled, mestiza, Latina, indigenous, white. Mm-hmm. You were raised in Latinx culture and living in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. So I'd like to begin there and just talk about, how you engage the world through all those identities and like why you decided to share that right away.
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate, I feel like, to grow up so close to, and to be in a place where both of where my family is coming from is located to some extent. Being in the borderlands is a privilege of being able to have multiple cultures right with me and part of my day-to-day experience. Then being disabled is also interesting here. Mostly, I'm not sure if it's totally accessible anywhere, but I feel like in the borderlands, resources are a little more limited, and in terms of just accessing day-to-day life, it's challenging, to navigate to the store or to different places. So yeah, I'm located in an area also that is really unique in terms of the environment, which is the Sonoran Desert. And so it's the type of desert that has the cacti with like the arms that you see on cartoons.
I love those.
Yep, the saguaro cacti. So, being able to, live in an area of the country that hasn't been bulldozed over, mostly because, I feel like just now they're figuring out what things to extract from this land, but it's been spared in some ways, and it's a beautiful place that just has a lot of integrity to it in terms of the ancientness of all of these plants that live for hundreds of years, actually. So the environment that I'm looking at is environments that previous generations were looking at, and that's such a privilege, that generational legacy.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I also want to start with just basically the most important question of all is why? Why did you write this book?
Oh, yeah. I wrote this book because I really needed it.
Yeah.
I got involved in activism when I was pretty young, a teenager, and I was running workshops here locally in the prison system and also in schools on conflict resolution. And I got involved in national disability activism and started an organization which I was running. And it was really interesting. As I got older, like into my 20s, I was, I had this like huge life-changing, life-altering experience about coming into community, understanding both my racial identities and disability identity in a different way, in like a political way, instead of just like a family interaction way or trying to go out and be in the world way. I had like these different ways of looking at myself, and I also saw the collective power that information created with other people. So I was able to really like live and just drench myself in that, and to work with other young disabled folks of color to come into their own identities and their own power and to start making change. But what I started noticing was, it hit a certain threshold and people just started disappearing. And then I was looking around at the spaces I was in, and there was very, very few elders in the room. And I was, it made me pause. Why was that? Yeah. And so I started asking people, people, when they started talking about why they didn't think they could do this work anymore, I wanted to know why. And I also was experiencing this, being a disabled person. A beautiful thing about that is that there are really defined limits to what my body can do. And that's a difficult thing too. And so, I was getting more in touch with my own capacity, and also being in pretty dysfunctional organizational systems and really burning out. And so I I remember I have like this very distinct memory of being in like a Barnes and Noble when those still were like around and existed, and like sitting in the self-help section and just pulling like every book I could try to find off the shelf to be like, there has to be some sort of perspective or answers in here about, you know, how to have more balance or advocate for myself in a different way or better organize my time, even something. And what I found was that it was primarily books written for really different people than me, people who had 9-to-5 schedules, people who had income and didn't have to, you know, maybe worry about hustling and doing, you know, side jobs. And anyway, it was just very difficult. I just was not finding information that I thought was useful. And it was really frustrating and I felt so alone. Like it was so isolating to not feel like that there was community in this idea of burnout. And this actually was before, I feel like self-care has really exploded in the world as like a marketing term and, you know, a different, as it's really come, but this is before people were really talking about self-care very deeply. And so I went and I actually decided to do formal interviews with a bunch of people, both in the US and Mexico and Nicaragua, around self-care. And actually, it wasn't even around self-care at that time. It was more around, hey, what's happening for you? What is this? What is your experience in this? And what I came to was that people were identifying constantly this concept of burnout and self-sacrifice, and that they were coming to burnout through self-sacrifice until they'd hit a hard boundary and they would leave. So it was like either self-sacrifice or hard boundary and I'm out of here. And so I was like, I wonder, you know, like what is there in terms of building capacity, not to have like just one answer, but, you know, for me, self-care was like an interesting lens to put on top of these problems as one of the answers potentially to help build capacity.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the elders, because I've been using your book at our like kitchen table every morning with our kids. And what we've been doing is, because you've written these chapters that are so beautiful and they're not too long, we're able to just read them while we eat breakfast. And then I ask them the questions like kind of as prompts for the day. Like I don't have them write anything down. I think it's definitely can work for like journaling, but like with teenagers, like that ain't gonna work.
Totally.
So it's been interesting to watch them just think about creating like good, healthy boundaries for themselves and spaces where they can say like, you know, I need to like walk away for a minute. And I really, I feel like just by practicing like being in community at the table and talking about it, it's caused them to create like ways in which they can actually engage in those like activities, you know, and that has been like super encouraging for me to watch as a parent. But yeah, I think like putting it together, like who were you specifically like aside from like, did you have any other like folks that you were thinking about when you were writing it?
Oh my gosh, yes. After my perusal of all the books in the self-help section, I was like, we need a book for like the rest of us, for like everybody else who doesn't fit into this very narrow, you know, audience that people think that, you know, time management or self-help is for, like businessy, dominant culture people.
Right.
So, yeah. So, and, you know, I really wanted to write something for my friends, for the people, especially in disability community that I was seeing, disabled folks of color, you know, experiencing like lots of different kinds of oppression, just really wanting there to be something real to be supportive. I think one of my like really big questions in writing the book, and really out of reading a lot of the self-help, was like, how can this work in real life? Because I think sometimes like in a lot of self-help books, they have like these, you know, like good advice, like you read that and you're like, oh yeah, cool, that makes sense. You know, I understand that. But then, you get to your like day-to-day life, you're like, I don't actually understand how to put this into practice, or like, what this even looks like in real life. Like what's the story of this actually happening, or what it can look like. So, and my book, I think, succeeds and fails maybe in some of that, but it's definitely my attempt to really try to put something like, this is how I tried to attempt this, or people I interviewed tried to attempt these things, and this is what it looked like in real life.
That's funny. I'm totally going to date myself, but when you were speaking just now, I was thinking about that Seinfeld episode, where I think it's like George Costanza's father is listening to some tapes. And it's like serenity now, and then all these things fall apart during his day, and by the end of the episode, he's just screaming, "Serenity now!" And I'm like,
so real though, right?
Yeah, it's not working for you. I just had this image, but it's true that you read these books and you like want to like definitely have like a buy-in, like you want to try, but then it really is like unsustainable. Like you can't do it. I think that's you named it Sustaining Spirit. So I think for me, like I literally got this book last year, and like now I read it as kind of like a devotional. Like I read, it's very circular in the way that you write. I should say this out loud. It's not very linear. Yes. So the way that the book, and maybe you can speak about this, is laid out is that there's different elements within the book that you have placed like things to think about, or chapters. And the elements are earth, fire, water, and air. And so I just thought that was so beautiful, because I like sometimes we'll just open it up and think like, which element do I want to like engage with today? And it's been really helpful. But can you speak about why you wrote it like that?
Yeah, I really wanted something grounded in the cultures that I come from. And that to me, so I talk in the beginning of the book about how the elements are, to me, the original ancestors, in the sense of a source of strength and a source of ongoing nurturance to our day-to-day lives that are often unobserved and unacknowledged. Mm-hmm. And so for me, in thinking about the different topic areas I wanted to write about, it was really easy and much easier for me to source like an elemental truth to them, in terms of like, does this fit within fire to me? Does this fit within water to me? Like in water, I both talk about, for example, grief and pleasure. And to me, those are very much connected to that element. So that's, to me, it was very, very important to ground in something different, something authentic to myself. And I think something that I was hoping would speak to people, again, like not your traditional self-help audience. Yeah. It would feel a little more authentic, right?
Yeah. I think it's beautifully written in that you use the space you talked about living where you live and like the area that you're engaging. I think for me, it's very different here than it is in the desert, right? I live in Southern California. I mean, it is desert, but let's face it, it's Los Angeles, so kind of covered up. But to take moments, even in the mornings, like when I walk my dog, just to kind of like think about like, what did this place look like, 500 years ago, like what did it look like when the original folks that were living in this space were here and they weren't colonized, like what did that look like? I think I don't tend to think that way on a normal, like we're just like plugged into society and we kind of chug along with our days. But just to be able to kind of contemplate that, even for that, hour that I'm out on a walk, has been really life-giving for me. And I really think that, the book has really helped me to kind of think about those types of things. So you do talk about the ancestors, but were there any specific mentors for you that like helped you put the book together?
Well, I did. I just wanted to comment on what you were saying really
Oh, yeah.
quickly. That's beautiful. And I really think it's important that we don't have to associate nourishment and kind of replenishment with just wild spaces. And I say that really as a disabled person. Like I spend a lot of my time when I go out to nature in parking lots because that's as far as I can get.
Yeah.
And enjoying whatever view I can see. So I think for me, you know, really connecting to allowing myself to see and connect to the things growing between the cracks in the pavement and feel the dirt that exists under the asphalt because it's there. That those things are really important to me in terms of connecting to place, even in the midst of a dense urban environment.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. Thank you for that.
As far as mentors, I actually ended up trading writing with several people during this time of writing the book. And that for me, I tend to be a bit rebellious. I don't function super well in like school settings. So classes often don't work for me, mostly because I kind of need to make my own mistakes and then be like, oh, that was a mistake. And, you know, then like fix it. And that's learning to me. That's how I learn. And so what was awesome about trading writing with people who are also writing books or different things, but working on their own projects was, you know, really seeing where people got lost and confused in terms of my writing or with the ideas I was sharing. And that to me was such valuable and so precious because I got to try to go back and try to say it clearer and try to be more mindful of how I was explaining things. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot through writing the book in terms of just developing skills and yeah. And also allowing myself off the hook to not sound like you're supposed to sound.
Yeah.
That was really important to me. I actually wrote almost a whole other version. This is a good story, actually. I wrote almost a whole other version of this book. It was very like much more traditional self-help. And the woman, her name's Corbett, that I was trading writing with, she's an elder, disability activist, queer, definitely like kind of that first wave of activists where, you know, she's very frank and honest, which I love. And, you know, I was trading writing with her and she, at one point I could tell she wasn't telling me something. And I'm just like, you know, tell it to me, like I can take it. And she's like, well, you know, this is well written at all, but I just don't think I would read this. I was like, whoa, like it was like really intense feedback, but at the same time, I'm like, okay, why is that? And she's like, well, I'm not connected to my body. She's like, I really like your more like stuff that sounds like your journal writing, where you're like talking about nature and you're connecting to your body and you're really like, you know, speaking from who you are. And I was like, oh, okay, that's so much more uncomfortable, but like an interesting challenge, right?
Yeah.
So I ended up rewriting the book to really just try to be as honest as I could.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a lot more vulnerable. I think that's the beautiful part about your writing is that it just really is very. I feel like I know, like by the end of the book, I'm like, we could be friends, you know, like we could like. And people should know, like prior to this, my daughter, who's 17, and we've been reading this book, ran in here and showed us her Halloween costume, and then also spoke about what the book has meant to her. And I just think that is such a testament to your writing and the work that you've put out in the world and that vulnerability that is seen like all across like ages. And I don't know, I think it's pretty beautiful. But before I ask more questions, I'm wondering if there are any questions that have come up in the chat or, yeah. Oh, well, Kathy Reese says heart. She loves it. So if you want to add some questions for our author in the chat, you can do so now, and we will ask. There are some other questions that I had for you, but I wanted to talk about like just the idea, I shared a little bit about this at the beginning about feeling like the burnout myself as a pastor, and like white supremacy and how it tells us that we have to do like things in a certain way, right? And so the burnout for activists, and then for me in my world that I've been seeing is for spiritual leaders, can be really alarming.
Yeah.
And there's so many of us that are giving without replenishing. And I think that is why I love this book so much. It's because the chapters in many ways, like I said, they serve as devotionals and prompts at every section. And so it's like a springboard. And actually it's interesting because I did think they were like journal entries. So I think that's interesting that that person said that about it. But it helps us think of little ways, like simple ways that we can do to kind of access self-care, So do you think of it in this way, like as a how-to manual for folks? Because I feel like that's kind of what you were intending, but is that something that you intended?
I think I really wanted something that got beyond sort of the level of like, do more and somehow do it better. Like I wanted, like I said, I wanted something that felt much more functional for real life. And so for me, one of the things, would it be okay if I read the definition of self-care that I came up with? Because I think that might be helpful. So I'll read this and I'm going to break it down just a little bit because it's a super dense definition.
Yes, please do.
So self-care means being aware of ourselves, where we are rooted, aware of what is around us, and evolving from the lessons we learn in order to survive and thrive. So there's a lot there. So to me, to break that down a little bit, so self-care means being aware of ourselves. That's really about our needs. Like, how do we connect to what we need? That's actually a really difficult thing. That's difficult for me to figure out in the moment what I need.
Yeah.
I'm lucky if I can kind of get to the basics, like, I'm thirsty, or I need to go use the restroom. Then like developing the skill set to figure out what I need in a moment is truly profound. And so that to me was like something that I wanted through the questions at the end of the chapter to support people to really do their own work with and reflect on. So self-care means being aware of ourselves, where we are rooted. So for me, it's funny, as a disabled person, place is huge for me. And I find a lot of nourishment from place. But like I said, it's really important to me that it's a place, that place isn't held up as like this lofty, wild space. Like you can only connect to place when you're in the middle of nowhere, like having hiked like 5 miles or something. It's like, that's not part of most of our days. And so how do we connect to place in the sense of like your favorite chair, your kitchen table, the sky that you can see, from where you're sitting? Like, what does place mean to you? And how do you root to that? How do you source that as something that can be nourishing? And so self-care means being aware of ourselves, where we are rooted, and aware of what is around us. And that's really about the relationship between myself and other people. So these are where things like boundaries are really important, development of boundaries. And to me, actually, one of the things I was surprised of through writing the book and practicing this for a while now, actually, is that boundaries let me be more present. Like I often think about boundaries as like taking me away from people or things, but they actually let me be more present. It's because I'm respecting, again, what I need in that moment to the best of my ability. So I can stay in my body, show up, listen deeply, be present to the best of my capacity. And then the last part of the definition is evolving from the lessons we learn in order to survive and thrive. One of my favorite interviews that I did, I interviewed like almost 35 people. And one of my favorite interviews was with a 14-year-old. And I was asking them how they would define self-care. And at the end of their interview, they paused. They're like, I think really when it comes down to it, it's about learning through trial and error. And I was like, learning through trial and error. I love that. I love that. It's not like having the answers or getting, it's just, or like knowing what we're doing all the time. It's like learning, letting ourselves really learn through experience and bringing gentleness to that and having that be allowed. I just love that so much. And to me, that's part of self-care, right? Like that's part of how we can support ourselves to have just lesser expectations and not have to feel like we need all the answers all the time, or that we have to show up perfectly formed and then we're ready to engage with the world. I mean, that's just not real. Not if we're, and it's not, if we're doing the work we're meant to do in the world, that's not actually how we want to be showing up. We want to be showing up cracked open a little bit, like being able to see, our own faults, our own strengths, what we can offer, but also what we can learn.
Yeah. I think that was like one of my questions was that I wrote down was what's something that people fail to grasp from your work, but do you think that is one of the things that they fail to grasp?
Fail to grasp?
Yeah. Fail to grasp.
Oh yeah. That's a good question.
That's actually, I'm not going to take credit. It's actually Lucia, my daughter's question.
Very insightful.
Yes. 17. She wanted to know that, like, what is it that people don't get, from your work?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think sometimes people don't grasp is the depth to the work, honestly. And not like my work, but their work. Like the work that it takes to do self-care. And I don't mean to make it like another to-do. So I really want to, let me think about how to explain this. So I think a lot of times the way self-care is talked about in the media is like bubble baths, a glass of wine, pampering type things, right?
Yeah.
Like, or exercise and eating right and, doing these like things that we're supposed to do. And those are part of self-care, but to me, they're only like one type of self-care. That's body self-care. So I actually, through the interviews, came up with 6 other types of self-care. But I think when people go to engage with the book, one of the things I hear a little pushback from is wanting more like kind of easily digestible answers. And my response to that often is like, well, I gave you a lot of good questions.
Mm.
Yes.
Yes.
That's what I was working from too, when I was trying to write. So it was these questions. It was like really trying to do the work and try it out. That trial and error thing, like people don't like that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like, because in the self-care aisle, it's basically like a how-to aisle, right?
Yes.
Like that's what it should be labeled, how to like do things. But self-care is so personal for everyone,
Yes.
and it's so different. Not to bring my kids up again, but my middle child, I watched her, she was on a Zoom call the other day, and there were some questions that were being asked of her as a young Latinx girl in the world. And it was really hard work to have her, I was listening to her, to have her explain how she viewed things in the world because of where she comes from and who she is, like how she's displayed, right? And they were asking her a lot of questions. And then she did the most amazing thing that I was like, oh my gosh. But she said, thank you so much for this time. I'm really sorry. I have to get off the call right now because I have another meeting, but I really appreciate the questions that you've asked. And I'm really going to think about them. And I hope that you think about some of the things that I've said too. But I'm going to have to hop off now. And then she hopped off and I was like, what's the other meeting? What's your other meeting? And she's like, I'm going to go make a smoothie because I need a smoothie. I'm meeting myself in the kitchen. So it's like, it is kind of pampering, but it was like a moment of like, I've hit a boundary and you've hit my boundary and they've it collided. And now it's time for me to step away.
Oh,
and I was just like,
such good noticing.
Great. Can you imagine? I'm like thinking, I was like, wow, if I would have known that, when I was like 14,
right?
opposed to like when I'm 40, what would I've been like in the world, you know, like, and I just think that I think that engaging and like being aware of like what our, not just like our boundaries, so that it's like the whole idea of like a boundary so that you can re-engage, you know,
Yes.
so that you can walk away for a minute, but also like I need to be able to walk away so that I can re-engage in these conversations later, and now is not the time. And I was just so proud of her, and it just, I took a lesson from it because I was like, yep, yeah, it was amazing.
That's
Actually, it's part of like one of my favorite chapters in your book is the monsoon nourishment. I love that chapter because it talks all about nourishment and how we can like nourish ourselves. And I just reflected. I remember it was during a season where I had a change of call, and I was reflecting on it, what the idea of nourishment where that comes from. Like, and you listed like art museums and music and concerts, or your yard or your patio, like where does it come from? And I just thought, you know, yeah, like we need to continuously ask those types of questions, right? Especially when people come to us and they say like, I'm overwhelmed. As pastor, I'm always like, what, like, have you thought about doing these? And I give them a list. Instead of like, it's terrible, but instead of like asking like, what nourishes you? And then listening to that and encouraging them. Yeah. So I don't know. It's just it's just like a smaller shift, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's what a lot of I discovered by really trying to delve into treating myself more gently. And like, for example, one of my favorite chapters actually in the book, and I go back and reread it too. Like I need it. Like I reread it and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot that already. Like, it's so wonderful to have those reminders. But one of my favorite chapters is on minimums, and it's the last chapter in the Earth section. For some reason, slow growth. I'm like, how am I blinking out the name of my chapter? So that's okay. That's all right. That's why I have the table of contents here. So slow growth, one of the things I love about that is asking myself, what is the minimum I can do instead of what's the maximum I can do? And starting from that place and realizing, like, my examples, it's actually around exercise. And my examples for myself is, you know, as a disabled person, again, having really defined body limits, what I can do for exercise hits a threshold and I can't add on to it. Like, that's it. Like, it's as good as it gets. And so for me, changing my framework from, okay, I'm going to like, you know, do this and then figure out how to like add on to it and build on it, which is always the advice, right? Like, we're always supposed to start small and then build on it, you know. And I'm not saying, I think that can be good for other situations, but for me, that actually I ended up injuring myself over and over again. I could not then, and I was like wipe myself out, and then I wasn't exercising at all. And so I was like, all right, let's back off this advice a bit and just like think a little bit about what's the minimum I can do. What can I sustain on like a weekly basis? And that really changed so much for me in terms of like my work, in terms of how I was approaching things, because it allowed me to like enter into something from a place of gentleness versus pushing myself really hard from the get-go. And sometimes I can build on things, you know, as I try it out, but like I need that time to notice, ooh, that really wiped me out, or ooh, I just injured myself for the third time because I pushed myself so hard, or things like that. So I think that.
Yeah, I am also thinking like in terms of like the pandemic, and as a pastor, prior to this call, I was a pastor and with a congregation that was, you know, like many of our pastors, like kind of displaced, and we didn't know what to do. And we hadn't ever done church online, and we didn't know what that looked like. And like many of us, I'm sure there are people out there who can relate. Like I had never used Zoom. I had never like done this, right? Like live streams. And so we had to like quickly learn how to do all this kind of stuff and then like produce. And it's church. And I'm like, since when is it like a thing like that I have to like, it was almost corporate in the way that it felt. And for me, it built up so much like anxiety that I wasn't doing things correctly. And I had to kept saying to myself, like, well, no one does it correctly because we don't even know how to do it. Like
it's all
like,
new.
The recipe that we don't even know the recipe. Like, you know, and but like, you know, and for me, it was a lot of like comparing myself. This is me being very like real with you. And just like, you know, because I didn't know how to do certain things and I'd see other people who did. And then I would like totally be disappointed in myself because I didn't know what I didn't know, you know, and it's just, I ended up in this vicious cycle and it was really hard. And I think that that was when I started to really feel like the deep burnout in my spirit. And recognizing like, how do you do like self-care even in the midst of all of this, right? And we're still in the middle of it. I mean, we have like a new variant. We have no idea what's happening, right? So I think, yeah, for me, I think that this is something that we need to just really start openly discussing and being vulnerable with each other, especially as leaders in our synod. So I was really excited to hear about this book and to be able to read through some of it because I think it does challenge us to think about self-care in different ways. Yeah. But what's something that you've been waiting an opportunity or a chance to say that maybe you haven't had a chance to say yet? Is that like book number 2?
And now I'm on the spot and I'm like, you know, one of the things I don't get to talk about very often, which I was really excited to connect with you specifically in this conversation around, is around the idea of accountability being spiritual work. So I bring spirit into the book a lot, and I have a very deep spiritual practice. I talk about a lot about ritual in the book, ancestral work, places where other places where we can draw strength, you know, besides like other people. So place, spirit, great spirit. And yeah, like I didn't know, I was curious for you. So in one of the chapters specifically, I talk about, it's a chapter Fire Break. You're following along in the fire section. I talk specifically about how I have this moment, this interaction with Grandmother Moon where I just hear from her, like, you need to treat your heart like you would a plant, a precious plant in a freeze. So in the desert, it doesn't freeze very often. And so, you know, we often have to cover things, water things, do a lot of care to keep things alive because the freezes are, you know, not very frequent and do kill everything off. And so, you know, I was really reflecting on that in terms of how I was approaching accountability and accountability work and how it is such a spiritual practice of trust and how hard that is.
It's funny you put me back. It's like we're playing tennis and you put me back on the spot. I think for me, it's just like I didn't grow up in the church. And so coming to church was an interesting thing for me because it's supposed to be somewhere where we're supposed to like carry each other's burdens, right? Like hold each other accountable, like do all those things. But sometimes it ends up not playing a place that we can do that in, or it becomes a very unsafe space, you know, specifically for people of color, people from the LGBTQ community, everybody that is on the margins of society. So for me, I think it is spiritual work, because if we're really doing like the work of Jesus, where we're gathering in those folks who are on the outside, and actually centering their voices and actually wanting them to be like in important spaces, right? Then we have to be able to do those types of things together. And the only way that I'll be able, and this is just me on my like soapbox now, the only way that we'll be able to do that is if we start to be a little bit more open and vulnerable with one another, with where we're at. And I'm not saying like we need to like voice like all of like everything that we want like privately, like don't do that. Like that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we need to be realistic about like our needs. And if we can't do that with ourselves, then how are we going to be able to like do that with one another, but then also like serve each other? So that's why I think it's like a thing that's interconnected. But that might be a little simplified.
Oh, no, not at all. I was just going to add to that. I think part of it too is also about developing some capacity and I dare say comfort with lack of resolution. Which is super difficult. And one of the things actually I really wanted to explore in the book, mostly because in activism, you know, it's not often that we get everything we want, you know, like we do an action and then everything changes and the world is like what we are imagining. And so it's like, how do we really deal with this kind of constant disappointment? And to me, that was like constant disappointment in society, constant disappointment in other people, in our relationships. You know, and really, you know, like how do we navigate this lack of resolution? It is so difficult. And I, you know, one of the things I situate myself in is the idea of it being a spiritual choice, like having to really trust that what I'm doing may not have the ripple effects I want in the moment, but it might 10 years from now when something else happens in that person's life where, you know, it's built upon. And man, is that some patience? And is that some like really like deep love practice with people that I really struggle with? Whew.
Yeah. I mean, that's hard. It's difficult, but it is difficult and it's worthy work. But sometimes I have to be really honest that I get in a bad mood and don't want to do it. Even as a pastor, like I'm done.
Lots of breaks.
Yeah. And I think that's like one of the reasons that this type of work, this like sustaining your spirit and practicing self-care is like so important, right? Because we're all human and we have our limitations and, you know, all of us need a moment to kind of regather, especially now. I think we've never seen the world look like this. And there's just so many things that are just even more magnified. And I think that we need to start like encouraging this type of like interaction with each other and like just respecting one another's boundaries and like loving each other where we're at and all that. So,
and also allowing ourselves to have containers where we're not responsible for having answers all the time with each other. I mean, I feel like a lot of our work with each other often, you know, we really want, again, I guess maybe the accountability thing, but we really want, you know, somebody to get it, or, you know, we want ourselves to like have some sort of understanding of what's happening in this world around us. And I agree, it is a lot right now. And so
it's the whole like, thank you so much for sharing with me. I'm glad that you shared with me and I'm glad that you heard what I shared. And I'm going to go now and then go make a smoothie.
Right. It is a lot of that. And it's finding spaces, which I imagine sometimes can be church. I also imagine sometimes through other kinds of like group ritual, which actually I write about a few examples in the book. You know, how do we create spaces where we don't have to have answers with each other and just being in the questions or being in the feeling of whatever's happening, or the disappointment of what's happening. Like we need those as much as we need times of celebration. It's like these spaces where we're not constantly figuring it out, where we just have space to be with like the intensity of what is right now is so incredibly important.
Yeah. one of my favorite verses in the Bible, my favorite verse in the Bible is the shortest verse in the Bible. And it's where it just says, Jesus wept. And it's right after his friend, right, his really good friend Lazarus dies. And then his sisters, I don't know if you know the story, but he's dead, right? And he ends up resurrecting him. But it says he like wept. He he didn't go right away. He like took a moment to just sit in like in the grief of it, and like the uncomfortableness, and like in that like moment, and sit with the weight of it. And I think that we tend to forget that that's the type of stuff that God does. You know, that there's this moment where we're not going to rush past and like fix, and we're not going to rush past one another when we're sharing, but that sometimes just sitting with one another in those spaces, those in-between spaces, is like I shouldn't say sometimes, that is holy work. It is holy work.
It is.
And I think by taking space and time with ourselves to do that work, then it becomes more, I don't want to say easier, but it becomes like you notice them more when they come up with other people.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Well, we're kind of getting out to the end of our time together. Thank you so much for being with us. We're going to be doing, just so you all know out there in the world, we're going to be reading this book, but we're going to be doing it a little bit longer and a little bit differently than our regular Bishop's book study. And that is because we're putting together a group for pastors, deacons, leaders, anyone in the Synod who wants to come and learn about self-care for social justice work, for sustainability. And we're going to be doing that over the course of 12 weeks. And it's going to start at the beginning of Advent and then hopefully get us through all the way through Lent. And we'll be going through because this is, we'll be going through the elements and reading, popcorning all over the book, but also taking some space and time to do some other things that I think you encourage in the book, and that is some art and some writing. I'm not a very good writer, but I'm going to try some poems, and just and just being with one another as we're processing during this season. So I want to invite folks to that. If you ever have any moments that you would want to pop in, it'd be fun to have you.
So honored.
Yeah, and just be looking for that on our social media to sign up, because that will be beginning on December 2nd and then going through April 21st, every other week for 12 weeks. But yeah, so we're excited. Thank you so much for writing this. Thank you for your voice and your presence here tonight.
The deepest compliment to be able to engage with people around these questions. It's like, that was my dream, honestly, when I wrote the book. It's like, maybe if I write about it, I can then talk to lots of people about it. Because I still constantly need, I still constantly have questions and would love to hear how other people are coming at these things.
Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Thank you.